Hello there and welcome to Wrong Ways Colombia cast with me, Brendan Wrongway Corrigan. Joining us today is the historian and author, Bogotano Daniel Raisbeck, currently Senior Fellow at the Reason Foundation, a free market think tank based in California. One of Daniel's most recent collaborations, a book he edited titled Bicentenario de la Independencia de Colombia, 1810-1830, in Inglés that would be the Bicentenary of the Independence of Colombia, 1810 to 1830. It's a collection of essays from experts in various fields covering a range of topics on Colombia's independence. Now, as we're recording this around the 20th of July holiday, Colombia's Independence Day, as it is somewhat erroneously called, we might as well start on that very topic. Now, for those of us in the dark, Daniel, what exactly are we celebrating on the 20th of July here in Colombia?
Right, Brendan. Well, it can be confusing because, as you said, it's not the actual Independence Day. What happened on the 20th of July of 1810 was that there was a junta formed in Santa Fe, Bogota, which was the seat of the viceroyalty. And you have to remember that the entire independence movement was the catalyst behind it was the occupation of Spain by Napoleon, and King Ferdinand VII was taken into custody. So that's what really kicked everything off. And on the 20th of July, 1810, you just really have the junta in Santa Fe, which was important because of being the capital, basically deposing the viceroy and taking power for itself. But of course, as you mentioned, it doesn't mean that the entire country was independent. It's going to take over 10 years for that to happen. And even when the junta in Santa Fe began operating, the rest of the country wasn't really on board, and they didn't accept the authority of this junta to govern them directly, because once the viceroyalty wasn't functioning anymore, then many said, well, we have a right to rule ourselves as well. So that, I think, in a nutshell, would be my interpretation.
Okay, yeah. So, but in a sense, it was kind of the springboard to independence, which eventually came, but I guess in kind of different stages as well, because for those, again, who might not be aware, we had Gran Colombia, which included present-day Venezuela, Panama, Ecuador as well. So there was a lot of different stages into what is the Colombia of today. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, I mean, and in the book you mentioned, I mean, I think that's one of the points that comes across, that it was a process. And at the beginning, you had several provinces, what eventually became the United Provinces of the New Granada. And but they couldn't even agree among themselves because Cundinamarca never wanted to join the federation, and there was even a civil war. And the first period, 1810 to 1815, is sometimes called, I think the translation would be the Foolish Republic or something like that, or the Foolish Fatherland, Patria Boa. And then, of course, in 1815, once Ferdinand VII comes back to the throne in Spain, there's an expedition from the Spanish army, and they completely put down the rebellions, and they have a restoration of Spanish power in 1815, which lasts until 1819. I think the real important date in this sense, I think traditionally seen, is August 7th, 1819, which is the Battle of Boyacá, when Bolívar's forces defeat the Spanish army, and it opens the way from Boyacá in the north to Santa Fe, but even then it takes a while, for instance, to defeat the Spaniards in the north of the country, in the coast and so forth, and then Venezuela, as you mentioned, is a whole other field of operations. But yes, so it is a process anyway.
Okay, yeah, and of course the Battle of Boyacá is another festivo that we celebrate here as well, coming up in August. Yeah,
well, that just gets you to the Colombian tradition of having as many holidays as possible during the year.
Yeah, we should exactly. We should have 4 or 5 Independence Days per year. Right. I love that. But you talked about the fact that initially in 1810 on July 20th, that the rest of the country maybe wasn't falling into line behind this junta and this declaration of independence. Was there a fair proportion of people that were relatively happy with the status quo, and that this was more a case of, we'll say, the sons of conquistadores, the mixed sons of conquistadores, deciding, no, we want to rule the country for ourselves?
Right. Well, I think that's a very good question, and unfortunately, we don't have Gallup polls from back then to measure this with any precision. But yes, I mean, of course, there's one interpretation that says that it was just the whole independence thing was a charade, or replacing one elite with another elite. But I mean, I think one thing that is discussed in the book is that I think, especially after 1815, after the Restoration, the Spaniards resort to a lot of violence and a lot of executions. I mean, people like Caldas, for instance, a pretty renowned scientist, is executed. So they basically get rid, or they execute a good portion of the ruling class, and this includes also a lot of women and rebel women who are part of the folklore, which didn't happen, curiously, in other colonies, apparently. And I think after that, I think you might be able to find evidence for a more popular sentiment in favor of independence, but it was after this period of repression. Before that, you didn't really have many large instances of rebellion, save, of course, for the Comuneros revolt in the 1780s, which was interesting because it was actually it amounts to a tax revolt against Spain. But aside from that, there's no really great movement that, which is why I mentioned the Napoleonic occupation of Spain is absolutely crucial. And if you're into alternative history, if you think if that had never happened, what would have happened to Latin American independence? It's a good question to put forth.
Yeah, exactly. I guess you reminded me of the saying that Britain's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity that we have in Irish history. So it was a case of Spain's difficulty was Latin America's opportunity, and also the case of, after the 1815 suppression, creating, I guess, martyrs, which is something that happened in Irish history as well in 1916, where there wasn't much popular support, so it is said, for the rebels that took part in the Easter Rebellion. But then after the executions of some of those leaders, it created that popular support. So you've that kind of similar line here in Colombia and Gran Colombia and this part of Latin America with that suppression after 1815.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the point of the martyrs is a great point, and I think that really helped independence, whereas you didn't really have that before, or not to such a great extent. And since you mentioned Ireland and Britain, of course, I mentioned the Battle of Boyacá in 1819, and it was even Karl Marx. A lot of people don't know this, but Karl Marx wrote a biography of Simón Bolívar, which was absolutely scathing. And one of the things that he says is that Bolívar only won the war against Spain because of his British and Irish and European mercenaries. So talking about the Irish Legion and the British Legion. And by this point, they were already incorporated into the army, and they actually created, in my view, the infantry, whereas before you would have a very irregular army. The mercenaries, especially British, Irish mercenaries, really created an infantry force that was able to defeat the Spanish army. And let's remember that a lot of these people, a lot of the soldiers that came from Spain in 1815, they were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. So it was quite a formidable army. And it required the incorporation of a European fighting force in order to defeat them.
Yeah, and am I right in saying as well, Daniel, you've family in that came and fought in the Irish Legion from Scotland? Is that correct?
Yes, in the first I guess Scot in my family that arrives in this part of the world, I think it was first in Isla Margarita, what is now Venezuela, was in 1819. So it was right around this time, and he was one of the few who actually stayed. Because then he had links with the Santander faction, because many of them were closer to Bolívar. So when you had the split between Bolívar and Santander here in Colombia, that created, I think, difficulties for many of the the foreigners. But of course, and Brendan, I think with your podcast, you're following in the footsteps of the great Daniel O'Leary, a great Irishman, in the tradition of Colombo-Irish relations.
Yeah, I just haven't got around to fathering. I think he fathered about 15 children or something. So
well, it's never late. It's never late, Brendan.
I'll work on that one in these quarantine times. But I'm going to move swiftly on from that, Daniel. But mentioning Simon Bolivar, you talked about the fact that he admired a lot of the Roman Republic and how that operated, and that his idea of a republic, which might seem like a contradiction in terms, was this aristocratic style. Can you expand a little bit more on that, what his vision was for this part of the world?
Yeah, right. Well, that's my take in the book, because I'm actually what I studied in university and so forth was classics and ancient history. So that's my interest in it, and I also become interested in the classical influence in this whole independence movement and phase. And when you read some of Bolivar's speeches, there was a famous speech he gave in Angostura, in what is now Venezuela, about what constitution the new republic should have. And he's, in his mind, it's very clear that the two, you don't want to copy, for instance, ancient Athens, which is a democracy. And for them, and in the 19th century in general, I think democracy is still not a positive concept. And even if you go to the United States, the founding fathers, James Madison, in the Federalist Papers, they say, we don't want a democracy, we want a republic. And when people thought of republics, or people like Madison or Bolivar, they thought of the Roman Republic, which was what a lot of people would call a mixed constitution. So you had, the consuls, which was basically a diarchy or associated with monarchy. You had the Senate, which others associate with aristocracy, and you have the assemblies, which you can associate with democracy. And that was the ideal. And in Britain, some people also saw a continuation of or a new version of the mixed constitution in the sense that you had, the House of Lords and the House of Commons and the monarchy. And Bolivar points to both Great Britain and to the Roman Republic as the ideal constitutions. And he even goes as far as suggesting a hereditary Senate. So I think, when people think of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela experiment tied to the image of Bolivar, they're completely overlooking that part of his political philosophy.
Yeah, I'm sure if Chavez and Bolivar, if they're meeting in the afterlife, they mightn't have too much in common at all.
Right.
Exactly, indeed. And of course, you mentioned that the United States, of course, was just in its fledgling days back then. So people had no idea how that was going to be. They probably thought that was going to turn out to be a disaster.
Right. Well, that's the interesting thing, because when you think about it, they didn't have the benefits that we have today of hindsight. So if you want to create a republic, which is what these people like Bolivar and Santander are doing, the United States is a very recent experiment. The other large major republic in historical terms is the Venetian Republic, which was recently destroyed also by Napoleon. So everyone is thinking really in terms of ancient Rome, and you're looking at the ancient at classical text to see what you can learn and what you can copy. And I think that's something that's been also overlooked in the way Colombian history or Latin American history has been told.
Now, Daniel, of course, there would be some that would say that Colombia today is a de facto oligarchy, plutocracy of a state. What would you say to those? Would you agree with that?
Well, I think I was actually listening to your Malcolm Dees, your podcast with the Colombian historian or British historian Malcolm Dees, who's one of the great historians of Colombian history. And I think I agree with him when he says it's nonsense to speak of a Colombian oligarchy in terms of there has never been a hereditary aristocracy here, not even in the colonial times. The obsession, for instance, with land and land reform is rather backward. And I think James Robinson also mentioned this as well. When Colombia is today an overwhelmingly urban country, every day, of course, maybe with this pandemic and especially the reaction to maybe that has suffered somewhat of a blow. But it is an overwhelmingly urban country, and you can see it in the towns, at least around Bogota, from what I've seen, that the young people do all they can to move to the city, to work and find opportunities there. So I think the obsession with the land and the oligarchy, at least in the traditional sense of a landowning oligarchy, is a bit mistaken, even if there's concentrations for other reasons.
Yeah, because I mean, people will say that in terms of presidents that this country have elected, they've come from a relatively small pool. Is that not fair to say?
Well, up to a point, I think you can. I mean, look at Iván Duque. I don't think you can say, he comes from this oligarchical family, or people like César Gaviria, or Turbay. So, I mean, maybe with someone like Juan Manuel Santos, you could almost certainly say that. But Lopez and people like that. But I think that argument is a bit overstated, in my view at least.
In terms of the land reform that you spoke about as well, again, the other maybe counter argument to that is that a lot of these large landowners, how they acquired those lands is questionable, to say the least, as well. There's a lot of grey areas.
Right. No, but I wouldn't disagree with that. I agree, but then you're in the realm of property rights. This country has never taken property rights seriously, and that's one of my big qualms in political terms. So of course, I'm a classical libertarian. So I think one of the few legitimate roles of the state is to defend property rights. And if the state is incapable of defending property rights, whether it's by attacks from guerrilla groups or paramilitaries or whoever, then the state is not fulfilling its basic functions. But I think another thing to say that there's an oligarchy because this there are no dukes or earls exerting much power in Colombia in the traditional sense.
Well, in theory at least as well, somebody can come from a public education and rise to the top, like in the United States. That's the theory. People will question the practice of it as well. And of course, there are clubs and jobs for the boys and the girls and whatever that. I guess that exists all over the world too, and in Ireland as well. Just you mentioned, of course, that you are a libertarian. You founded the Libertarian Party here. That's correct?
Yeah, well, it's not a party. It's very difficult to create a party in Colombia because in order to become a party, you have to have representation in the Senate, which means, and the way the electoral system is set up, the election for the Senate is a national election. So you can get votes from the Senate anywhere in the country, which means that in order to win seats as a senator, you have to get, I don't know, it must be somewhere around 400,000, 500,000 votes, which is a lot of votes in Colombia. What I did when I ran for mayor of Bogota in 2015 is that I created it's called a citizen movement, and they require you to hand in signatures from people who are basically endorsing your candidacy. So I handed in over 100,000 signatures, which allowed me to run as a candidate. But once the election is over, even if you win, the movement can't go on from there. If you wanted to run again, you would have to do the whole signature thing all over again.
So it's rather difficult than what you're saying to set up a party in this country.
Yes, that was one of the reasons actually why I ended up being opposed to the process between Santos and the FARC, because creating a party through the legitimate route is extremely difficult and even expensive, because the state forces you to pay a premium, which you don't get back if you don't get the votes. So I thought it was outrageous for the FARC, who had, even if it was legitimate for them to participate in politics, I think it should have been under the same rules as everyone else, especially after all the crimes they have committed. So, I thought it was a bit preposterous for them to be given free seats in Congress and all the advantages of a political party without going through these electoral steps as everyone else would have been forced to do in the first place.
It's a fair point indeed. I guess I thought that myself at the time, that maybe they could form the party and then just go to the electorate, and if they get votes, well and good. If they don't, well, then they have to contemplate their fate. But I guess people smarter than myself perhaps figured that was the best way to go with the peace process. Just as a right libertarian as well, and you mentioned James Robinson, he had a theory, of course, that in his book, the narrow corridor of this narrow space where states must operate, and he talked about Colombia having a weak state and a weak society. Would you agree with that, or do you think that the Colombian state has its hands in too many things here?
Right. Well, I agree in insofar as the Colombian state certainly doesn't have control over the entire territory, and that's why you have all these problems in the countryside and in the more peripheral regions. I think you can't argue against that, and you do need a stronger state in that sense. On the other hand, I think the Colombian state is extremely bureaucratic and even sclerotic, and I mean there's all sorts of measures in terms of the amount of time it takes to start a business, a legal business, and the money it takes. So basically, running a formal business in Colombia, it is a privilege of the well-to-do. And that's why I think you have 50% or over 50% informality. And I think it's directly the fault of the state, of the Colombian state. And I think also taxes are way too high. I mean, I think you would know this better than I do, Brendan, but as far as I understand, Ireland's success in the past few decades has been built upon having a very competitive tax rate in Europe and also in global terms. And that's how you attract the investment. And I think in part that's why you have these big tech giants in Ireland, and that's how you get also the knowledge transfer. So that's how you create the virtuous circle of saving, investment, and job creation. And I think in Colombia, among the political class and what you can call the technocratic class and in academia, there's basically a Keynesian consensus that you always need more state spending, and they act as if they were France or something like that. And I completely disagree with that. I think you have to let people's talents flourish, and I think the state has to get out of the way of the private sector. And when you have such a big state and such interventionism, what ends up happening is that the big companies just pay for lobbying in order to get all these advantages, and that's why you have so many oligopolies in Colombia and monopolies in some cases.
Okay, yeah. Well, mentioning Ireland in that regard, obviously our tax policies have come in for criticism from other countries as well. But the one thing that Ireland, I guess, gets a little bit of plaudits for is how we redistribute the taxes that we collect in terms of helping the most vulnerable. And that's something that came up in a previous podcast with Leopoldo Ferguson, the economist from Los Andes, about reforming the taxes here in Colombia. Again, would that go against your raison d'etre? But he was on about expanding the base as well, of course, and bringing more of those informal workers in.
Right, but you're not going to expand the base, which is necessary, because according to my last calculation, and this was a few years ago, you only have around 4% of the population paying direct taxes. So I don't think that's going to work in the long run. When in the countries that these economists look up to, you have around 50% of the population paying direct taxes. But the way you're going to expand that base and bring the informal sector into the formals is not by hammering them with taxes or with bureaucracy, which is what happens now. So I think you need to have much more flexibility. I also think you need lower taxes, and even if you want to redistribute wealth, you have to allow that wealth to be created in the first place. And I think that what you're seeing in Colombia over the past few years, especially, because you also can't have a tax reform, which in Colombia is just a euphemism for raising taxes, every 2.5 years, which is what we've had. Because for investors, you're changing the rules of the game in the middle of the match. So I think there's all sorts of structural problems, and I think they're going about it in the completely wrong way. And in this pandemic, let me tell you, I'm extremely concerned, because I've seen several terrible ideas being put forth in the media, and a lot of the political class agreeing to them. One of them is the universal basic income, which, as far as I understand, it's already being put forth in Congress. A country like Colombia doesn't have the luxury of experimenting with that, especially when it's something that's supposed to cost like 14% of GDP approximately, from what I read. There's no money for that. Another terrible idea is basically 0% interest rates and quantitative easing. Maybe, I mean, if you're the United States or the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, you can have the luxury of doing that, which I think is also terrible for those countries. But in Colombia, where you don't have a reserve currency like the dollar, they can't pay debt in dollars by printing pesos. So I think it's a terrible idea. And there's also the idea that suddenly the debt doesn't matter, and that we can just accrue more and more debt to pay for all this spending as a result of the pandemic. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think they're making it worse. This is the worst crisis in living memory in Colombia. And I think measures like the ones I mentioned are creating a potential disaster.
It's interesting because I guess depending on what side of the Atlantic Ocean you're on, this idea of a universal income is something that seems to be gathering momentum in some of the northern European countries that perhaps are a little bit more social democratic in outlook, versus the United States, of course, which would be veering away from such an idea. So in terms of Colombia, it seems to be caught between two stools in some ways, but you'd be saying it should follow more so the United States line.
Well, I mean, depending on what, I mean, I think in terms of Colombia, I think there's a consensus in terms of the political class, because the media love to talk about polarization and how divided the country is. And that usually revolves around certain questions, for instance, the FARC question, which is basically about how to incorporate the guerrillas into the political system. And I mean, there might be disagreements on moral questions like abortion and that kind of thing. But surprisingly, when it comes to economics, there's a lot of beneath the surface. I think there's a consensus, maybe with a few outliers, but they're all in favor of more public spending. Whenever we have a debate about tax reform, there's nobody saying the state should spend less. We should cut bureaucracy. We should, maybe not have as many people living off the state. That never really comes up. It's always about how we can get more money through taxes for the state. So, I mean, at least that's my perspective. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me, but I think the evidence is there as well.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction that you're part of this free market think tank, the Reason Foundation, is it, based out of California? I mean, the free market right now seems to be something that's under attack. And, I mean, even Donald Trump, before COVID-19 became an issue, was putting up the barriers, you'd have to say, and continues to do so. For right libertarians, especially obviously in the United States, that seems almost a bit of a cognitive dissonance for them with Donald Trump, because a lot of them would support him, but he's also seems to be doing his bit to kind of attack that free market that we've had, and the whole slogan of "Make America Great Again." Where do you stand on that?
Right. Well, I mean, don't forget that you also have the Libertarian Party in the United States, which actually is a party, and they also have a candidate in this election. Of course, it's a very small party, but you do, if you're a libertarian in the United States, you always have that option. Or if you're more pragmatic, it's usually comes down to choosing the lesser of two evils. Of course, with Donald Trump, the whole trade war and the tariffs are far from libertarian. Some people argue that it's just part of a negotiating strategy in order to have more free trade. I'm not so convinced. So definitely but also in Great Britain, I think the current government, maybe some people, even I thought, I've been actually following Boris Johnson for a while, and to a certain extent was a fan of many of his policies. But I was expecting a more free market libertarian government, and it's been more social democratic, we can say, up to now. So across the world, I mean, there's not really one interesting example I actually wrote about is Uruguay, the new government and the new president, Luis Lacalle Pou, who actually is quite I would say he's from what I know, he's the most libertarian leader in the world right now. Of course, it's a small country, but I think it was significant that with this pandemic, for instance, he resisted strong statist measures. He said he refused to raise taxes on the rich and on corporations, and he actually taxed the public sector and said it's the individuals and the entrepreneurs who are going to bring us out of this crisis. So I think it's a flicker of light in a small country, but you never know.
I guess maybe this is the problem that we're faced with, that if the likes of the United States and Great Britain retract into their own shells under protectionism or whatever you want to call it, and China then begins to fill that void in other countries, the free market under China, for many people, considering their record of human rights and the not very democratic country they have, that's a completely different concept that we're facing into. How comfortable would you be in a world that's a free market world dominated by the Chinese?
No, I think that would be a contradiction in terms, because if you look, many of their large companies, and you've seen this with the Huawei debate, they're just proxies for the Communist Party. So it's definitely state-run crony capitalism. I wouldn't want that world, and I definitely wouldn't choose that as a model to follow.
Okay, so I take it you weren't too happy when the contract for the metro here in Bogota, if it ever happens, that went to a Chinese company, didn't it?
Yes, it did, but I mean it's just one of these farcical things with the metro, because I remember when I was in the campaign some 5 years ago, one of the candidates said, I can bet you that in 4 or 5 years we'll still be talking about the metro, and it still will not have been built. And he was absolutely right. And well, of course, you can't blame it on the politicians anymore, or not so much because of the pandemic. But we'll see if it ever gets built. But I didn't follow the intricacies of that.
The contract, yeah.
The contract of giving it to the Chinese, but. In that kind of sense, I mean, as long as it gets built, I think it would be something to celebrate.
Yeah, as long as it happens. Although, yeah, who knows?
At this stage,
right. Exactly. Everything's going to be put on hold, especially with the current crisis we're going through, and really we don't know what way we're going to come out of this, especially in this part of the world. Probably a nice way to finish up, though. You mentioned, of course, that you ran for mayor 5 years ago. Do you still harbour political ambitions, or are you done with that?
Yeah, I'm mostly done. I think what some people who contact me sometimes don't understand is that the campaign was I knew from the beginning there was no chance of winning. We spent extremely little money compared to the big campaigns, but the goal was to get these libertarian ideas in the debate, and the more we appeared, for instance, in the TV debates, the more we were able to do that. And I felt we had quite a bit of success, and I think it was recognized in some media outlets. And just to give you one example, one of my big proposals was the whole charter school things, which in Bogota are called colegios en concesión. And there was a big controversy at the time, because actually Peñalosa had created the first batch of 20-some schools during the first time he was mayor. And then when Petro became mayor, he wanted to basically shut them down. And that's when I got involved with a lot of the parents, mostly in the south of the city. And the parents and the students absolutely loved them. And they didn't understand why a left-wing mayor such as Petro, who was supposed to be on their side, wanted to shut down their schools or to give them over to the teachers union, which is extremely unpopular, at least among this group of parents. So that was one of the big points I made during the campaign, and I think that was one debate we won. And then when Peñalosa won, he inaugurated a bunch of new schools. So that's just one example that sometimes you can run a political campaign for very concrete aims, and you can get things done in terms of what some call moving the Overton window over to your side of the argument. And I think a lot of people, as a result of that campaign, were introduced into free market or libertarian ideas for the first time, because and that's the reason I ran, really, because these ideas, I think, have been absent from the political debate. And the Liberal Party, which you would think would defend these policies. Well, as it turns out, they have been a member of the International Socialists for several decades. So and the Conservatives, the Conservative Party, which I belong to for a bit less than a year, they're not into free market policies either. So I think there was a vacuum, and it was interesting.
Okay, well, mentioning the Conservatives, of course, we do have the first lady vice president in Marta Lucía Ramirez, who is from the Conservative Party. Are you generally happy with how the Duque presidency has been going?
Well, not really. I think, well, even during the campaign, Duque said a lot of things I didn't like. He promised no more free trade deals with any country. He promised all sorts of protectionism, and he was trying to do a balancing act with his whole orange economy spiel, which to this day I don't really know what it means. But I mean, I think it was also tough luck. I mean, not only for him, but also for new mayors, even Claudia Lopez, because when you run, you have your agenda and you have your plans, and if you win, you obviously want to implement that. And I don't think any of them were counting with a pandemic. So it's unfortunate, and of course it now and during the next few years it will all be about how did you handle the pandemic, both now and afterwards. It's going to be about the economy, because I think we're only at the beginning of realizing the amount of economic damage that's going to result from the lockdowns. So we'll see. I think I have been a bit more encouraged in the last few days, insofar as I have seen Duque more willing to admit that lockdowns aren't the solution to the current crisis.
Yeah, well, I've written plenty on that on my blog in El Tiempo too, so I think people can check out where I come from on that perspective. But yeah, I don't disagree with you on that either, and I think we're going to be living with this probably for the next generation, and the problems that are going to come down the line. But I was hoping maybe we'd get an exclusive from you, Daniel, that you were going to say you're going to run for presidency or mayor, but that's not on the agenda, no?
Not for now, not for now, Brendan. But well,
anything could happen. Exactly, you never know. Don't rule it out. Let's go back to where we started, though. Just remind us of the book, and if people are interested, where they can get it.
Right. Well, the book, it's called the short version, Bicentenario de la Independencia. It was we launched it on December of last year.
Okay.
It's actually the official book with the government and the Banco de la República, the central bank. I think the only place where it's sold, and I'm not sure if it's open at this point, it's the bookstore at the Luis Ángel Arango Library in downtown Bogota.
Okay. Which I think is under strict quarantine at the moment, but I'm sure people, when right. It opens, yeah, we
so or they might have some delivery, but they might even be closed. I think they're probably closed.
Well, it'll open at some stage. People might be listening to this podcast in a few weeks' time, and hopefully everything, well, not everything, but things will be slightly back to normal or whatever. And of course, Daniel, you're on Twitter if people want to follow you there, yeah?
I am. It's at Daniel Raisbeck, and I'm a frequent Twitter user.
Like Donald Trump, perhaps, something like that.
Maybe
not quite.
Maybe not as effective. But
indeed. You're building up the followers. Anyway, Daniel Raisbeck, thanks a million for taking the time to join us here on Wrong Ways Colombia Cast. If you want to get in touch with me, of course you can via the Twitter handle at WA Corrigan, and my Facebook page, it's at Wrong Way Corrigan blog. But until the next time, ciao ciao.